So the state of play is actually not clear, right? Friday night, we kind of believed it was a reprieve of consumer electronics in particular not being subject to the 125% level tariff. By Sunday, you have the administration saying it is not a pause or a reprieve. It's just that we will have electronic-specific tariffs to come. When you got to your desk this morning, where do you think that we stood?
I think we stand at, personally, my opinion is I think this was part of the master plan. It's hard to actually know if that will actually be the case or was the case. But I think, generally, at least on the tech aspect of these tariffs that we've all seen and announced on April 2nd, there was no way that the economy was going to sustain around these, really from the U.S. side, but really both sides, I think, if you really boil it down. So I think many were expecting this. That was just discussed on previous interviews that you guys have had today. But I think now it sort of comes back to actually the previous Ryan that from your team that you just had on made a good point, right? I think we're not seeing supply chains move that much. There's been pull in. We expect there's going to be a lot more just to get done what you can, just in case it's a Q2 thing. But even from the analyst side on the street, it seems like everyone's kind of holding ground because of the uncertainty across the board.
You published some really interesting data from IDC this morning on the smartphone market in the first quarter. And this is the market share figures, right? And this is why we keep focusing on Apple in particular. You see that after, Samsung, single biggest player after Samsung. But generally, the market grew 1.5% in the first 3 months of this year. I'm seeing a lot of evidence that there was some front running because people knew tariffs were coming. How much did that factor into your research?
There was definitely a play of it into the numbers being, I guess, growth in the first quarter and so forth. But I don't know that it was as drastic as what we sort of saw in some media headlines towards the end of March. What we're seeing is a lot of that activity works now. It's coming to fruition, especially with the pause on tech. So there's really two ways to think about this. The supply side understands what they're up against day to day, hour to hour, right? There's either a tariff on or off. If it's off, you make a decision of, do you want to just speed up things to try to produce, build, and ship? The consumer side is not that sort of straightforward because generally I think what the industry is looking at, we're certainly looking at is, does all of this uncertainty that's consistent, like basically owning the news, does that just overall slow down economic demand? Not tech related, but just in general. And we believe it does. Okay. So I think that's also a factor that these OEMs, Apple included, have to build in. You don't want to ship too much in and then have it sit there if people aren't willing to buy because they're concerned.
Brian, you just said the supply side does know what's going on. You really think that? Well, let's take Apple as a case study, right? The reporting from Mark Gurman is that the strategy right now in the case of the iPhone is prioritize iPhones built in India, move them to the United States. I think in India they do about 30 million handsets a year. That's nothing in the scheme of things of the overall production, given that most of those iPhones go to a big market in America. Do you really think that they have a plan to adjust and that they understand what the administration is doing with electronics tariffs?
I don't think that they are guesstimating the plan. I think that some companies, this is speculation, just to be very clear, would either have some discussions that have been ongoing since the election. Prior to that, that's just what big companies do every election year. But I would think that they were very focused on tariffs because that's what this administration ran on. And I don't think that they know every detail, but I would assume that some of these big companies were either forewarned or have some heads up, but maybe not. And I think that the India piece keeps coming up with iPhone, and I think it's very interesting. And no question in my mind, prior to April 2nd and even this election, the plan was to ramp up more towards the end of a set, more assembly and manufacturing in India. That's been pretty well disclosed. But whether or not this shifts things that quickly to be able to feed the U.S. market, I'm a little bit more on the skeptical side of that. But I think that these sort of pause or exemptions, whatever you want to call them, on China, that's going to be the focus. Try to build as much where it's the most efficient in the product lines you need.